Good morning, Boker Tov, and hi there. It's Rabbi Leah bringing you Hi There with Rabbi Leah. Hope you all had a wonderful weekend and a great Monday, and it's Tuesday morning again. And today what I'd like to do is briefly finish up the information that I've been sharing with you about the history of Jews and plagues. And I know that on the surface it may not sound like a very inspiring or important subject, but I think that I've learned a lot from doing my research on this, and I hope you've learned a lot as well, because I think that there are some very interesting commonalities between the historical plagues through which Jews have suffered along with other peoples, and what we're learning from this pandemic now. So in the most recent class, I talked to you about some modern day writers, and by that I mean writers of actually today, starting with Susan Einbinder, who was one of my professors at Hebrew Union College, who talked about the Black Death and for a 500-year period of time, how the Black Death was integral in the way in which Gentiles treated Jews, blaming Jews for contaminated water systems, for poisoning various cities so that Gentiles would come down with the plague, for living in an isolated manner so that they weren't as susceptible to the plague, and so on. And a lot of this scapegoating we have seen happen today as well, in terms of the origins of the pandemic, the blaming of Asian populations, and some of the horrific violent acts that we've seen perpetrated against Asian Americans by those who are blaming them for the pandemic. So there are lots and lots of similarities. We also talked about an author, Joshua Teplitsky, who looked at the plague that was in Prague in 1713 and how the plague impacted the Jewish community there, and that it really inspired a whole new genre or area of study, mainly health measures that could be taken, Jewish collective action among the Jewish population, rabbinic answers, rabbinic responsa that were written, and so on. And this gentleman, who's a professor of history at Stony Brook University, has been studying the Jews and plague for a book that he's writing for over 2 years now. And when this happened, it almost seemed as if it was too, I don't want to call it serendipitous, because there's nothing positive about a pandemic or a plague, but it was almost an eerie coincidence for him that that we should be living through this again. And what he looked at was the response of communities, their responses in terms of preparation, emotional responses, and so on and so forth. And he found in the writings of a particular author by the name of, and now I can't find it again, that there were great similarities in terms of the way in which the Jewish community in Prague prepared for the plague, with not only emotionally, with dread and this sense of an impending doom and waiting for the worst to come, but also in terms of dealing with the isolation and dealing with preparation of food and supplies so that they would be able to live through the epidemic of the plague. Also wanted to talk to you about the concept of the wandering Jew as a carrier of disease. And this was a piece that was written by Galit Hassan Rokem, who is the Max and Marguerite Grunwald Professor Emerita of Folklore at the Mandel Institute of Jewish Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Imagine putting all of that on a business card. You'd need a very large business card. And she talks about the sin of the wandering Jews in medieval and early modern narratives, and how that notion of the wandering Jew was often blamed for the spread of plague or pandemic. And it has its roots in the very distant past, when in the story of Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus walked to carry the cross upon which he was going to be crucified himself. And he asked to rest through the narrative on a wall of a Jerusalemite who refused to let him do so. And Jesus was then evidently cursed to eternal wandering. And so these images of the wandering Jew who doesn't stay in one place, but is perpetuating their sins in more than one location, is a meme, is a trope which has developed certainly in the 19th century and in various discussions about philosophy, politics, religion, art, music, literature, that moved the Jews' sin to the present. Now, the narrative of Jesus walking with his own cross and not being allowed to rest against the wall of a Jerusalemite was one thing. The sin of the wandering Jew, sadly, is not necessarily born out of the Jews' desire to move and to wander, but out of necessity, because we were either thrown out of certain areas and forced to wander, or the danger became so intense that we took it upon ourselves to leave. You know, when you think about that scene of Anatevka and Tevye and the Jews leaving Anatevka with everything they own on carts and on their backs and in their hands, it wasn't because they wanted to go. It was because the pogroms from the Tsar and the Russians became so bad that they had to leave. So it isn't out of hey, let's take a vacation and try a new place that the Jews have been wanderers, but because of the situational circumstances where Jews have lived. And possibly what Dr. Galit Hassan Rokem talks about is the most famous of the wandering Jew of the century. It's a marginalized figure in a novel called Les Juifs Errants. How was my French pronunciation, considering I don't speak French? Written in 1944, which was originally serialized in a Persian magazine. Les Juifs Errants means the wandering Jew, and later it became immensely popular worldwide. And the bad guys of the novel, believe it or not, are not the Jews, but rather the Jesuits. The wandering Jew appears mainly at the beginning and the end of the novel and embodies a disease. And so wherever in the world the Jew appears, a cholera epidemic erupts. And it is, however, the evil Jesuit Rodin who uses this disease in an attempt to gain power and wealth. So the Jew as a carrier of disease becomes a trope and a theme that is echoed throughout medieval writing and medieval prejudice associating the Jews with plague. And unfortunately, more fatally, that notion is then brought into the most anti-Semitic of the Nazi movies, like Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew, which was produced in 1944. And we see the Jews, and I'm sure you have seen parts of this film. It's not fictionalized. It's supposed to be a documentary showing of a vile procession of rats, also traditionally seen as carriers of the plague, representing the unbounded movement and distribution of Jews throughout the world. And so this particular professor writes about how the wandering Jew is seen as the source of the plague, because wherever they go, it crops up. And of course, throughout the centuries, as medicine became more sophisticated, unlike in the Dark Ages, when disease was seen as punishment, and certainly in the biblical times, the Jews were punished through plague whenever they misbehaved. That really isn't the same thing that happens in later centuries when medicine becomes more sophisticated, when doctors become more knowledgeable about how disease is perpetuated. But unfortunately, these themes of Jews as carriers became embedded in Christian belief, just as did things like Jews murdering Christian children for their blood to make matzah, and so on and so forth. The Jew became the ultimate scapegoat, the ultimate purveyor of this disease and the spreader of this disease. And therefore, when we talk about the wandering Jew, sometimes we use those words lightly or in a more cavalier or comical sense, but it's not really that way. Okay. Finally, I read a piece from Rona Seidelman, who is the Schusterman Chair of Israel Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Yes, there's actually a Jewish Israel Studies department at the University of Oklahoma. And she has been studying a different aspect of plague, and what she's been studying is the history of quarantine. And she's been studying the history of quarantine for decades. She says early in her PhD, she came across one of the most fascinating subjects that possible. Who would have thought that studying quarantine would give somebody a window into Israeli history, while helping her to really consider some of the more fundamental questions about society, about fear, about exclusion, about welcoming and care. And we know that in Israel, there has been a history of quarantine, quarantining Ethiopians when they first came in, quarantining certain non-Jewish Arab populations, African populations when they come in. And now we are, of course, seeing this in our own society. Quarantining of the other. Quarantining of people who are coming from foreign countries, who have to stay very much isolated for up to 2 weeks when they come in. The irony being that in many of these foreign countries, not only is the pandemic under control, and not only are such a much higher percentage of their citizens vaccinated than we are here in the United States, but these people are put into quarantine anyway. And so she's looking at quarantining here in the United States and throughout the world as a really critical moment of quarantine history that she's not really going to be able to go back and look on until years in the future, because we know that history is often written with an eye towards how we look back on it. You know, they say that hindsight is 2020, and we don't know the impact of this pandemic right now until 20, 30, 40, 100 years from now, when we look back on it, as we look back on the Spanish flu of the early 20th century and how that impacted society in general, or how we look back at the Black Plague, the bubonic plague of centuries past, and how that impacted humanity. So she says that in teaching her students lessons over the years, she says, if I were to distill the most important lessons I have taught my students over the years that can help them or us in this moment, this current moment of the pandemic, she says, there are two. One lesson is from the history of public health, that when implemented carefully, quarantine can work. And this is why we had stay-at-home orders and shutdowns in so many states at the beginning of the pandemic. Because not knowing enough about the virus, not knowing enough about its behavior, not knowing when or if a vaccine could be developed quickly, and it's truly miraculous that we have these 2 vaccines right now that are available to us under the emergency use declaration by our government. Not knowing the best way to deal with this is to quarantine and isolate people from one another. Remember, in the very beginning, it was believed that the virus could not be passed from one person to another. And early on, they did discover that it was human-to-human contact that spread the COVID-19 virus, and therefore, the best way to maximize or minimize the spread was to isolate, to stay at home, to work from home, and to not go out unmasked and have contact with other people until more was learned. So she said that's one lesson she learned, is that when implemented carefully, quarantines can work. And she should know, she's been studying quarantines for decades. And the other lesson she learned is from Jewish history, and that is that in uncertain times, watch out to make sure that our most vulnerable communities are not unfairly targeted and excluded. And she says she knows this from carefully studying history, and that knowing this matters. And so part of her study of plagues and quarantines also has to do with the study of vulnerable communities. And in the case of COVID, we have seen that vulnerable communities have suffered. And who are those vulnerable communities? Well, we know for a fact the communities of color are highly vulnerable for a variety of reasons, because of lack of access to testing, lack of access to medical, quality medical services, physicians, because of the abundance of underlying conditions, kidney disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and so on. And finally, because of a lack of trust in the medical community that comes from many centuries of maltreatment of communities of color when it comes to medical experimentation and so on and so forth. So in addition to communities of color, We also know that Asian American communities, who are also, I would consider, a community of color, have been vulnerable during this pandemic due to the belief by some at the beginning that this was a hoax, and that if it wasn't a hoax, it was a horrible epidemic, pandemic that was perpetrated upon the citizens of our country by Asians, by those from China. And so this hysteria, so to speak, has led to an enormous surge in anti-Asian behavior. Some of it, unfortunately, extremely brutal and violent, resulting in injury and death of a number of Asian Americans here in the United States. And so we are clearly sad that it has been perpetrated on that community who are suffering from the Asian flu from the from COVID-19 as along with others who are this is similar to what happened to Jews during the plague, where even though Jews were having incidents of plague along with every other religious group, they were blamed. So we have to be very careful about what we call this and how we approach it. Okay, I'm going to switch now for the next few minutes that I have to talk about one of the 3 mitzvot that you must perform on Purim. And Purim, of course, starts Thursday night and goes Friday and Saturday. I'll talk more about that on Thursday for the Purim program that I'll be doing for all of you, which will include a very creative Megillah reading along with a little service, along with some other information. Okay, so what is it that you have to do on Purim? What is it that you have to do? Well, you don't have to dress in costume, and you don't have to eat hamantashen, although those are fun things to do. But one of the mitzvot is that you must hear the Megillah being read, preferably twice, once on Erev Purim and once on the morning of Purim Day, which this year is this coming Friday. And you are obligated to do something known as Mahasit HaShekel and or Mishloach Manot, which is to send goods, Goods, or gifts. And in the Megillah, in the Megillah of Esther, we actually read that Jews celebrated their salvation by Mishloach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu, which means delivering manot, delivering dishes, not plates and cups and saucers, but actual dishes of food to their neighbor, to one another. And that is the source of this mitzvah of Mishloach Manot. So I'm going to give you the halacha, which is the strict traditional Orthodox Jewish mandate of what this has to look like. And then we can do the things we like to do. Mostly people give candy or fruit or maybe or hamantashen or something like that. Okay, so first of all, when we say Mishloach Manot, the delivering of dishes, how many is that? Well, the halacha, the Talmud tells us that it requires 2 distinct items to one person. And that is derived from the word that's in this verse of the book of Esther, because the word is manot, which is plural, and it means dishes. So don't just show up with one casserole you gotta bring two. And it indicates that they have to be different. Therefore, you're not allowed to give two portions of the same item to a person. It has to be two different things. And even if the two items are packaged together, they're still considered separate. So if I make a vegetarian lasagna and a tuna noodle casserole, I can wrap them separately in two different little Tupperwares, put it all in one bag, and even though it's all in one container, it's considered two different items. Okay, so needless to say, you're always going to get a rabbi, or maybe even more than one, who's got a different spin on this. And Ben Ish Chai, who was Rav Yosef Chaim of Baghdad he lived in 1833 to 1909. He said that each item must be in separate vessels, meaning that you can't put two different items in one bag, that they've actually got to go into separate containers. But Chacham Ovadia, who was more lenient, said that, the majority say it can all go together in one container, and that's okay. So, what kinds of things can you give? The requirement is that mishloach manot, the sending of dishes, is food. So you're really not supposed to give money or other valuables. Now, I want to give a poskim to that, which is I just want to give another idea to that, and that is that if you're in a situation where you cannot send food or dishes, yes, you may give valuables, or better yet, make a donation. Give tzedakah to a food bank or whatever. But that is permissible. So the other thing that they say is that you can give a voucher to eat a meal in a restaurant, assuming that the recipient would eat two different dishes there on Purim. So if you give somebody a voucher to go eat a meal at Olive Garden, they've got to have two different dishes. They can't just have a salad. They have to have a salad and soup, okay? The food must be fit for consumption. Therefore, you can't fulfill the mitzvah by giving items with substandard kashrut. If you got a leftover bag of candy, that won't do it. But they actually say that if one gives candies to a diabetic, they have fulfilled the mitzvah, because even though the recipient can't eat them, he can pass them on to somebody who is permitted to eat them, his children, etc. Women are obligated to give. Modesty in Orthodox Judaism says that women have to give to women, and men can give to men, and that men it's required that men not give to unmarried women, because it's going to, maybe cause some confusion. And that the gift may imply some sort of marital implication. So husbands give to their wives, wives can give to their husbands, women give to women, men give to men. Boys and girls over the age of bar and bat mitzvah are also required to give these gifts of food. The word l're'ehu is singular, indicating that one recipient is sufficient. So you don't have to give to an entire community. It's to enhance the joy and the communal spirit of the holiday. But the more that you can give to, the more people, the better. And since the reason for the mitzvah is to increase joy, you can give mishloach manot, these dishes, to any person, even if they are wealthy. And you don't give it anonymously, so it's not like tzedakah, which we can give anonymously. If the recipient does not know the identity of the sender, it doesn't count. You got to know. So, the recipient has to find out about the gift. So if you leave it for somebody in front of their house and they're away until after Purim, they're not going to enjoy the gift on Purim. Therefore, you have to call or text the person and tell them that there's a gift waiting for them and that they should be aware of it. Okay, when do we give it? It's a mitzvah on the day of Purim, preferably right after the morning Megillah is read. And if you give at night, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. So you got to give 2 items, 2 different dishes. You got to let the person know you're giving it to, who gave it to them. If they're going to be gone, you better let them know that it's sitting there and waiting for them. And you have to do it on the day of Purim and not that night. So no belated mishloach manot. Okay? I hope you all enjoyed this. I'm very excited about seeing you all again on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock for a creative reading of the Megillah. Have your masks ready. You're going to be getting groggers and song sheets and other things with which to celebrate. So tune into SVTV at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. I'm sorry, on Friday morning. Friday morning, I will see you there. And for now, I'm saying goodbye from Chai there, Rabbi Leah, and I'll see you on campus soon. Bye-bye.